So if you want dates on Reconstruction, and these are some dates, yes, go ahead. These are some dates that I'd like for you to kind of commit to memory, because it's one of those things, like we've talked about with other dates, that will help you in the long run when you're trying to put together in your mind what history looks like. And the date there is going to be 1865, which is the end of the war. (1865) through 1877. Reconstruction lasts for 12 years. 12 years. 76-ish. It really doesn't end, though, to the Compromise of 77, so I always say 77 just to keep it easy. All right. So, there are some key issues. The war ends. The smoke clears. And there are over 620,000 dead people. 620,000. The devastation is total. Political, social, and economic. So the questions that have to be asked: how can the South be brought back in the Union? How do you reunite? The second question: how do you rebuild? I'm coming. The South has been totally destroyed, and so how do you fix that? We're having a historical experience in the screen's room. I got 20 contestants. Which one you want?
Me.
Gunner! All right, thank you. All right. Gunner, go home. All right. So the third question we must ask ourselves: how do you integrate the between 4 and 5 million newly freed, emancipated, free black men into society? And the term freed men, of course, isn't. It's more of a gender-neutral term. It's not just referring to men, but still. And then the last question that's going to kind of be the big argument here is, who's going to be in charge? Who's going to run this show? Now, I have suspicion that had Abraham survived the theater, well, with all of his capacities survived the theater, then this might have been a completely different radio. But that's not our situation, is it? The president's dead. And so he is replaced with somebody who, for lack of a better term, is not very presidential, is he? One of the things I love about the Johnson video, or the Johnson audio, excuse me, is when you listen to it, you realize just oftentimes when we look back at founding fathers, we portray them to be these perfect individuals who always said the right thing and did the right thing. And I don't think anybody could say that about Johnson. Yeah. I don't think they could say any of that about Johnson. And so had Lincoln survived, or not been shot, we will say, I think it would have been a much better experience as far as perhaps for everybody involved. Because I think Lincoln, he plays ball a little better. What do I mean by plays ball? He's willing to work with people. Where when you look at your Union Party, or when you look at the group here that is going to be ruled by Johnson, Johnson doesn't play well with others. He's the kid on the playground that you're always having to get onto. It's funny sometimes because one day Micah came home and he was really upset about this child who had behaved badly to the point that I thought the kid had messed with Micah. I was like, well, what did he do, buddy? Why are you so upset? He was upset because he was constantly getting in trouble, this kid is. And so, long story short, Johnson is that guy. He's that guy who's going to be constantly getting in trouble. He does not play well with others, right? And so, is that going to be the person who's going to be able to work with Congress through one of the hardest things our country had ever gone through? Yeah. So you don't only have the situation of going through working with our country through the Civil War. That's over, but now you've got to deal with all the crap left over. I mean, the Civil War, you just don't quit, right? I get there's stuff to it, but still. So here we are after everything is done. So let's talk about some of the stuff that happened during the war that I briefly mentioned to you to say we're going to talk about this after the war, but you need to be familiar with it. A little bit of wartime reconstruction. So during the war, Lincoln knew we were going to eventually have to reconstruct. And to do that, Lincoln was always 3 steps ahead. He was always working on what comes next. Honestly, to lead something like the country, you kind of have to have a little better long-term plan than what's on the docket for next week, right? You've got to be working, especially with all this junk going on. So Lincoln here issues what's called his 10% plan. He presents it to Congress. Now, to give you some kind of idea of dates here, this isn't that long after the North has won Gettysburg. He's already put in place the Emancipation Proclamation. And so they know that they're going to eventually more than likely win this sucker. Okay, they just got to kind of march it out and see what happens. And so what he's hoping is the war is going to end quickly. Now it drones on for another year and almost a half, but he's hoping he can get done with it faster. And he wants to present a plan to the South. They've already got to get rid of their slaves, but he wants it to be where it is not so horrible that maybe some of them will start to quit and just say, okay, look, we'll come back. All right? So he's still kind of optimistic here. Of course, we know the timeline. We know the surrender doesn't come till 1865. But after Gettysburg, he's like, what have they got left? So he thinks he might can end it quicker, which he can't. So he sends to Congress this plan called the 10% plan. It's not a total failure. 3 states from the 11 states come back in. Now, granted, those 3 states were already pretty much defeated by the North. So it wasn't like they're all like, oh, okay, we'll come back. It was like, okay, you've already been defeated, so here's how you're coming back in. But still. So those are going to be Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. So things seem to be progressing well with Lincoln's plan. I mean, 3 out of 11, it's not too bad. So then, Congress doesn't like this, though. They're bitter. And honestly, you can't blame them. They just watched the southern states lead a rebellion that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. Many of them they knew, I'm sure. I'm sure they knew some of these people. And so they don't think that Lincoln's plan of 10% we're sorry program is quite enough. And so what the Senate passes, and notice they pass it, but hang on. They pass a bill called the Wade-Davis bill. How do we know it doesn't become a law? Because it says bill. It would have said Wade-Davis law. So here's what it says. 50% of the men who voted in 1860 had to swear allegiance to the Union. 1860. Now, here is why that number, 10% seems a little low. 50 might be a little high. You're like, well, 50 is only half. Those 50% could have in no way aided the Confederate Army. They could not have participated in the Confederate Army. They could not have participated in the Confederate government. So even like the Jonestown show, the Free State of Jones that I showed you, where the guy like changes his mind on the battlefield, he couldn't have signed this. Despite the fact he had decided he hated the South and wanted to go back with the North, right? You could in no way be tied to the Confederacy and sign this. So finding 50% of the population who didn't have those things under the requirements that they're going to put out is going to kind of be hard. It's a little tough. It also required a state constitutional convention in which they would elect state officials, and it also guaranteed specific rights for African Americans as far as freedom and also some protections. That part's really good. Now, Lincoln feels like 50 is not going to happen. He doesn't like this bill because he feels like it's too strict. So what they do with this, he says, this is not going to work. We're not going to be able to get the states to get this 50%. There's not enough of them. He says it's basically going to cause destruction in the states, and then the states are not going to come back in quickly. And so he doesn't agree with this idea because they want it to be like a conquered province. I don't know that they're wrong, actually. I mean, the South led this rebellion, right? But Lincoln doesn't feel the same way. And so what he does with the Wade Davis bill is he takes a play from the Andrew Jackson playbook. Yes, it was either going to be that or kill off all the Native Americans. He goes with the pocket veto. So he pocket vetoes the bill. Well, Wade Davis and all of their friends get kind of bitter about this, and they're getting all fired up in Congress, and they're ready to go after Lincoln, guns blazes, but somebody beats them to it. Lincoln dies. Too soon? Okay, 150 years. All right. So, okay, so the pocket veto, who wants to explain it? It's pretty easy. No, it's not hard.
You can veto it and you can just keep waiting on it. And not getting it. It's basically, wait, so do you table it?
It's like you table. I'm not gonna sign it.
Write it out.
Well, that's now.
Well, back then, you had to wait till like the end of the year.
Back then, well, anything that isn't finished by the end of the year dies. So now we have a law that says within 10 days the president has to make a choice. If he signs, it becomes a law. Well, yeah, but I mean, you got to think most bills that pass, like probably 95% of bills that pass in our country or more, are not hotly contested bills.
Yeah.
Like otherwise, all Congress would do is meet when we would have problems, right? And so they pass all sorts of bills that are just like, everybody in favor? Aye. Okay. Everybody in favor? Aye. Okay. And so it's like sign, 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 sign. However, those hotly contested bills, they don't get to the president quickly. So he's had lots of time to think about it. It's kind of like, and I don't want to go into the issue, but it's kind of like the flag issue here in Mississippi, where your governor had spoken out against it, but he even said if it passed the state Congress, then he wasn't going to veto it. He said if Congress passes it, even though I think the voters have already voted, I'm not going to veto it. I'll let it go. Even though he had said he wasn't for it since the voters had voted one way. So when these big issues come to them, they've already made their decision. Does that make sense? So it isn't like they sneak it in, they put it through Congress today, and tomorrow they're like, whoa, okay, we're going to bomb the Soviet Union. You know, it's not like that. These are things that have been going for a while, okay? So here's the deal. Lincoln dies. Well, congressmen can't come out guns blazing and be like, Lincoln sucks because, well, he's just been made a martyr. He's a hero. And you don't go after the dead guy. Because dead people become
Ghosts.
well, they do that. But we kind of, a lot of times when people die, especially in the way that Lincoln dies, we martyr them. It means like we make them like they're holy, almost. They died for a cause, they died for a purpose, and we make them where they didn't make mistakes. But you know how that happens? You know how when people die, it wouldn't matter if it was, you know, if Adolf Hitler would have not been quite as crazy as he was and lived out and died a natural life, you know, they'd have been like, well, you know, he made some bad decisions, but he unified Germany and, you know, and I mean, it's the funeral speech, right? The funeral speeches are always about the highlight reels. And so the highlight reels are what gains the press. A lot of the bad stuff kind of gets played down, especially when somebody is assassinated the way Lincoln was. Because it's kind of like he didn't have to go down that way, you know? It's that kind of thing. And we feel sorry for people that die in that kind of manner, you know? And oftentimes, it makes those individuals more popular. Weirdly, but it does. All right. So anyway, a little bit about the 13th Amendment. Congress is going to ratify the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, and it is important because no more slavery.
Period.
It outlaws slavery. And it is important to have an amendment because slavery was protected under the Constitution. The Constitution did not say we will protect slavery, but it included slavery as existing. And so therefore, to change the Constitution, you have to have an amendment. So the 13th Amendment says no slavery. Done. The 12th had to do with fixing the election. Remember how with the presidential election with Jefferson and Adams, that it was the person who got the most votes got to be president, and the runner-up was the vice president. And so the 12th Amendment is going to fix some of that. That's it. Yeah. All right. And you will know, we will learn the rest of the amendments. You'll learn 13 through 27. They're not hard. Most of them kind of go with their numbers, which really helps. All right. So the Freedmen's Bureau, one of the smartest things that Congress does that really gets a bad rap sometimes is the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, anytime you hear freed men, again, we know that's gender, whatever. But this is referring to former slaves. So the Freedmen's Bureau is geared at helping former slaves. Now, it is often defined as an early welfare agency. Please don't think of that term welfare as in welfare check. This is welfare as in the well-being of slaves, former slaves. So this group has a couple of key significances here. First of all, I think these people are really pretty awesome. There are a lot of former abolitionists in the North who felt moral convictions about slavery. Thank you, Second Great Awakening, right? And they come to the South. Why do they do that? It's because these people who they felt should be free from slavery, they wanted to help them have a better life. And so they weren't just the group that was like, slavery's bad, let's end it and send them back to Africa. This was the group who wanted to make life better for African Americans. And so they're going to serve a couple of purposes here. The first one, they're going to help teach former slaves how to read. There is such a liberty, there is such a freedom in knowing how to read and write. For one thing, if you do not know how to read and write, you don't understand the written language. And so it can be used against you as a tool to hurt you. It can be used against you as a tool to deceive you. Absolutely. Absolutely. Also, these African Americans, a lot of them are going to enter into labor contracts very soon. And when they enter into these labor contracts, how do you know what that contract says if you can't read it? You don't, right? I've had to sign a lot of contracts in my life. Of course, everything you ever sign up for on the internet now, it's like, do you agree to these terms? Yeah, those you just check them all, and you're like, yes, I give you my I don't know, my kidney. Yeah. You never know what you're signing for, right? Do you agree to the updates with this? Sure, I'll take an iPhone. But anyway. So what this does, these people come south for that purpose, to help former slaves learn how to read and write, and to also help other former slaves negotiate land contracts. Because learning to read and write, that doesn't necessarily happen rapidly. And also, these contracts are written in like a legal language that some of us still even struggle with when we're educated, So it's kind of a stretch here. And so they want to help African Americans have a better life. Now, some of the individuals that do come south, not members of the Freedmen's Bureau, come south to help rebuild the South, to help actually do the logistical work to rebuild. Those individuals, some of them are reputed to have tried to rip off widows that were rebuilding houses and things like that. Probably. But what you see is all of these Northerners, or as I'm sure they were affectionately called, these Yankees, get grouped into one group, right? Why? Because for the old South, the old white South that have been so entrenched, all of them are going against their purpose.
Wait, what are these?
All of these people who come south, either to try to help African Americans or to try to help rebuild, they're all going to be called carpetbaggers. Now, I'm sure you learned about carpetbaggers in middle school. Let's talk about what a carpetbagger is. So, yes. If you've ever, like, you have rugs or something at your house, like, you know how the underneath of the rug has, like almost like a rubber type material? Okay, they didn't have exactly like that. They used a different, like, tar that it would dry out. And what you can do with that is that's a lot more sturdy. People didn't have suitcases unless you were very wealthy. You didn't travel very much. And so they would take these old pieces of carpet. Because if you put it in like a little, if you put it in just like a sheet or something, that's not going to protect it, you know? So they would take these old suitcases because they didn't travel a lot. And so
I
they
would
would
do
do
when I was going to run away, give me a little sheet, wrap it up.
it looked like a little hobo with it thrown over a stick. Yep. I remember packing my clothes one time to run away. I have no idea why. Like I kept them like packed in the corner of my room like forever. I don't know where I was going with it. But I was ready.
I like would get to the end of my driveway and turn around.
Perhaps after the video, I'll tell you about when my best friend ran away. It's pretty funny. All right. So the Freedmen's Bureau, the South hated it. The South, the white South that has been in control of the government for so long, they hated it. For African Americans, it taught 250,000 how to read. Now, 250,000 out of 4 to 5 million is not a lot, but it's a start. The other thing that I think is cool about the Freedmen schools is that their pupils, oftentimes they would accept children as young as 6. They had people of all ages learning how to read. There are documented cases of adults that were in their 70s and 80s learning how to read for the first time.
That is like so cool.
I think it really, it's like just like a Lifetime movie kind of moment, right? Where you're like, oh, it's grandma, she's learning to read. Oh, sweet. Yeah. So this is an actual photograph because we're actually getting into a photographic era, which is nice. This is an actual photograph of what a freedman's school looked like.
Wait, on the photographs back then, didn't you have to like stay in position for a long time?
It depends on the type of photograph, but oftentimes, like this was probably very posed, but as they're going to move forward, you don't have to as much. The portraits, you did have to sit them.
This is like 1860.
This is going to be late 1860s.
Yes, they set them up.
This building, probably not, because you can tell it doesn't look like it's necessarily an extremely well-built building. You can see the holes in the wall. Yeah. I don't know about, it may be, there are some of these old buildings that do still exist. But, so check this out. So this is an example of a freedmen's school. You see the stovepipe in the middle of the room. Have any of you ever actually seen one of these?
Yes. Yeah.
You don't really see a lot of them down here as much anymore. Yeah, if you get north enough. Of course, we have so many storms and things that come through that, like, for things to last that long is pretty uncommon. All right. So let's talk about Johnson gets involved in this. So the Freedmen's Bureau is up and running. Slavery is no longer legal because of the 13th Amendment. And let's get Johnson involved. So who is Andrew Johnson?
He was the vice president, and then when he died, and then he became president, and he drank a lot.
He was racist.
Yes, very racist. Yeah. Anyway, that podcast taught me a lot.
I love her podcast. I like her voice too. She does a true crime series. That's how I actually got into hers. Crime Junkie is hers.
She sounds like the girl, the Storytime girl, what doesn't make up. Oh, I love her.
Oh, the one that talks about the murders? Yes. I love her too. So did you see the one about the lady who like locked this girl in the basement?
Yes.
That one, yeah, disturbed me. Okay. So check this out. But yeah, I like her YouTubes as well. All right, so Johnson is a Jacksonian Democrat. That means he's of Jackson's kind of old school. Yeah, because that's always good, right?
Oh, yeah.
Johnson is also white Southern aristocrats.
There's no white people.
Now, somebody asked a really good question last block.
No rich people.
And I think a lot of times we assume that everybody understands certain things, and that's not fair. Do you guys know what we mean when we say aristocrats?
Rich
The
people.
rich, the elites, the rich. It doesn't necessarily mean you're in politics, but you have influence. You're an influencer. People listen to you. So he doesn't like the elites. He also doesn't like the African Americans in the South. He doesn't like the wealthy whites. He doesn't like the poor blacks. So he likes the poor whites in the South, and that's it. So if you're not white and poor, he is not your friend.
Well, that's dumb.
And so he also agreed with Lincoln that the states never legally succeeded. That is kind of the one thing he and Lincoln shared. So here's the plan that Johnson puts in place. He puts in place a 10% plan that is similar to Lincoln's, but not exactly.
10% off.
The 10% plan, similar to Lincoln, but not exactly. So let's talk about what it says. So, let's discuss his plan here. First of all, he says that only the 10% of people have to swear loyalty. Again, they can't have been Confederates. However, there's an escape clause. He offers amnesty. What does the word amnesty mean?
Community.
Yes, but it is immunity, but I think you have to add with that also immunity or forgiveness. Immunity is the same thing, right?
I just remember Bill saying something about immunity.
I want to make sure you grab that forgiveness part of it. So he offers basically, it's okay that you had one of these positions as long as you come to him and personally ask for forgiveness. So how big is your ego? He wants them to basically come to him and be like, oh, Mr. Jackson, sir, I am so sorry that I owe or Johnson, that I had $20,000 worth of property. Forgive me. You're forgiven. Sorry, Mr. Jackson. All right. So, also in their constitutions, they must repudiate slavery. Repudiate means speak against it. They must repudiate secession because he wants to be like, yeah, I told y'all secession doesn't exist. See, they said it. Because he is that cocky. And lastly, he wants them to speak out against state debt. I mean, okay, why not? So, with this, he also goes in and names the governors of the new Confederate states. He picks his people. So they can get forgiveness if they ask him. They have to outlaw slavery, secession, and speak against state debt. And he gets to pick the new governors. Now, what are the effects of this? Basically, the old South that was in power becomes the new South that's in power. In fact, she even got to this point on her broadcast where she said that the new government looked like the old government. To the point to where the Republicans in Congress wouldn't even call their names. Georgia sent former vice president of the Confederacy to be their new congressman. And so when they saw him come in, some of the other former Confederates came in wearing their Civil War uniforms. Like they literally came in like basically trying to start something, right? I mean, that is totally coming in with an attitude when you're like, oh, you see this? I'm back, I mean, that's really what it is. Congress is not amused. So Congress refused to accept Johnson's new government. In fact, to tell you how many pardons he granted, guys, 13,500 people. He's like, okay, next. Yes, I pardon you. next, grab a little bit more. I pardon you too. And you, and you, and you, and you. And so he pardons a whole lot of people.
I love it.
Okay, so what is a pardon?
Wait, is that how we get people out of jail?
Yes, and it can be. So a pardon is where you are forgiven of a crime. And so, like for instance, when we talk about President Nixon is going to do some very downright shady stuff. Extremely illegal stuff. And he gets caught and he quits before they can impeach him and kick him out. And when that happens, the new president comes in who wasn't involved with that. And he's like, yeah, I pardon Nixon. And so at that point, it didn't matter what Nixon did. Like, you could do the worst thing ever. And actually, the president has the authority to pardon any crime except for his own. So, for example, Osama bin Laden organized the bombing of the World Trade Center. That happened in 2001. George Bush could have gone on television the next day and been like, Osama, I got you, dog. I pardon you. Now, he wouldn't have done that, but he could have. If the president pardoned it, that crime would be forgiven.
No matter what it was, governor, like I can murder somebody for this.
There's a one that's specific that I think about is President Carter pardoned an heiress by the name of Patty Hearst. Her whole story is rather interesting. In the 60s, 70s, early 70s, I believe, she was kidnapped by this group, and she was with the group long enough that she kind of got in with them. And so she's been missing for like over a year, and they get her on video robbing a bank. And she's like holding an AK-47 robbing a bank. Like, she's not like in the group. Like, she could have gotten away. And so she ends up later getting caught and arrested and serving time in jail. And so she claims Stockholm Syndrome, which is where you fall in love with your captors and you become like them. Yeah. And so long story short, she was pardoned a few years later. Usually pardons aren't like I said were well.
That is a thing. It does happen. It really just does.
Yeah, but I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it. Okay, but anyway, I digress. So pardons usually don't take place like the way I said. They also usually don't take place like the way Ford did it. Usually a crime is already like this person is convicted, and they're not extremely common. Now, a governor can pardon for a state crime. But a president can pardon for federal crimes. All right, so back to this.
Wait, president pardon for state crimes?
I don't think so. Because federal and state crimes get into different categories. My understanding is only for federal crimes. All right, so check this out. The revival of Southern defiance. With these new Congresses in place in the South, in the states, they're going to pass all of these laws that put restrictive rules on African Americans that are called black codes. Now, I want to make sure that you understand the difference in the black codes and the Jim Crow laws, because these are similar, but they're in different time periods, if that makes sense. So black codes are going to be during Reconstruction. Jim Crow laws are going to be after Reconstruction, basically. All right, so the black codes included all sorts of crazy things, like some of them had to do with basically creating sundown towns, if you know what sundown towns are. Sundown towns had to do with curfews, basically for African Americans and minority people that did not exist for other people. Sundown towns, we'll talk about those a lot in the 40s and 50s. But anyway, so there are all sorts of black codes. Now, black codes were also divided by states. Different states had different black codes. So what's going to happen is Johnson has allowed this to happen, whether it was intent or not. So let's talk about why does the South put these black codes in place? Well, they do so because they want to guarantee a stable labor supply. So the way that the cotton has built the South, they have become dependent on slave labor, or they see themselves, I should say, as dependent on slave labor. And so they want to make sure that they have workers for their fields. And so they start passing these laws to restrict the movements and rights of the former slaves. And it's really not accurate to say just former slaves because, there were free blacks as well. And this also restricted the rights of free people of color or people who had been free before the Civil War. It restored pre-emancipation race relations. There were laws, particularly, like one of the only positive that came out of the Black Codes is it did allow marriage where during the slave era, African Americans could not marry. However, the Black Code strongly enforced also not only race relations, but also intermarriage was a no-no on any form, for sure. They also forced many African Americans to become sharecroppers. Now, there are 3 terms that I want you to get with sharecropping. The first is obviously sharecropping. The second is tenant farming. A tenant is a person who lives in a place. And the third term, to make sure that you get here, is the crop lien system. Lien. All right, so let's look at, let's see, I passed it somewhere. There we go. So check this out. Let's talk about sharecropping in the South. This chart shows you where sharecropping took place. Now, if you look at the area that we live in, you did not have very many sharecroppers, if any. The green area here around the Gulf Coast, almost all the way across, means 0 to 12% of African Americans were sharecroppers. Why so low? Because of the sandy soil. It was not something that was profitable. However, when you get into some of these other places, this number is 35 to 80%. All right, and so when you look, like here in north and western Alabama, you get into like coming here through Georgia, parts of Mississippi, but it kind of, I thought the same thing earlier. I'm like, that is a really big grouping, All right. So a little bit about how sharecropping worked. I thought this chart did probably one of the best jobs describing sharecropping because it gives you the role of all the parties involved. So with sharecropping, there are basically 3 roles. So Deja, was it 20 you needed, honey? Okay. You have 21? I got you. All right, because they turned in 21 yesterday. All right, guess what? I saw it. I didn't want to forget. Okay, so the 3 groups you have here. The first is the furnishing merchant. Realistically, the person who makes the most money off this system are the business owners because they make off everybody. So check this out. So the furnishing merchant would loan tools and seed at 60% interest. Now, I'm sure your parents or other adults, you've heard them talk about credit cards and how credit cards will rip you off maybe. Do you know how much interest credit cards charge a year?
38.
It's in the 20s usually, mid to high 20s, so about 28. You can get lower, but a lot of times they'll start out like 28% interest. So that means if you spend $100 on your credit card, well, if you didn't pay it for a year, they charge you late fees. But let's pretend there's no such thing as late fees. Let's pretend they give you a year, no late fees, no payments.
A year?
Well, for my analogy here. So at the end of that year, you would owe $128. With this type of loan, you get $100 worth of equipment, they charge you 60% interest. At the end of that year, you owe $160 for what would have cost you $100. You start thinking about that. If I'm looking at buying 2 things at the store that are equal and one is 100 and one is 160, I would much rather buy the 100, right? So what they do is they get these people to buy all this stuff, but the interest is huge. 60% interest is insane. And so then they tell them that they need all this stuff, of course, because basically, slaves don't have like random farm equipment that they bought, right? And so how the farms are set up, to give you a little, help you understand this. So with the plantations, back with the old school plantation that we had, you would have usually the big house, owner's house. Some were bigger than others. And then out here you have all these fields, maybe a small garden. And somewhere on the farm, you have a barn, maybe a couple other outbuildings. And then you would have slave quarters of some sort that are very, very small. So this is more the plantation style. All the workers worked the land together, okay? Sharecropping, however, is set up completely differently. Can y'all Bob Chance back there? He's like, there we go. Hey, Sunshine, we have to get you in a different chair. You're struggling on me. All right. So in this situation, instead, the land would be divided up like this. And so maybe back here you have a couple of buildings. All of these others would have a little house, and you would have property that you were responsible for working. So it would be broken up by families instead of everybody works together. And so this is how sharecropping works. So you would be responsible for your land, or for the land you're renting, basically. That's why you're a tenant farmer. You're renting. And so then what would happen is you needed equipment, so you had to pay the merchant. You would also need clothes, shoes, right? All this other stuff that we just generally need for life. And how would you afford that? Because, like, did you have like a big slave savings account? No, that didn't exist. You didn't get paid. And so what would have to happen is you would have to borrow that money. Guess what? There's that interest again, right? And so they're like, sure, go ahead and buy the clothes. Go ahead and buy this stuff. And so that would go on your account too. And so then the merchant holds a lien or a mortgage against you. So all that money that you owe comes in on the money you make off the crops. So at the end of the year, these tenant farmers, what they would do is they would plant the crops. They would harvest in the autumn and the fall. They would have to turn over half of their crops, usually 1/4 to 1/2, for rent, depending on the agreement that they had with the person who was leasing them the land. Then they would have to give usually the remainder of their crops to the merchant to pay for their debt. So in the end, do they really get anything out of this system? It's often referred to as a form of almost legalized slavery. Now, some do manage to put back some do manage to save. Some actually are very successful with it, but they are the exception and not the rule. And it's not that they're doing anything wrong. It's that the system is set up to cheat you, basically. You can't get ahead. This is part of it. Part of it is deliberate. And to be fair, part of it is that farming is hard. See, here's the cruel thing about farming. There are two major concepts that you have to realize. The first is supply and demand. So how supply and demand works is the less of something there is, the more expensive it is. But if you have a bad crop, that means if you had a few to come out, they're very valuable. But what if your whole crop went down? You have nothing, right? Then let's go to the other side. On the other side, you have an amazing year. You produce 3 times as much as normal, but guess what? Everybody else does the same thing, and so your price drops to where you're making half of what you were making for it before. So this is just such a bad trade-off, and the fact that with farming, it is hard to ever break even. And this is what they see with this farming system. And so you see how each of these 3 parts work in the farming lien system. The merchant, the farmer, and the landowner. Okay. So anyway, let's go back to the problems for farmers with the black coats. So back to Johnson. So check this out. This is where things fall apart. You need to get this. So we said Congress kicks out the other people, right? Yes. Congress kicks out the Southern members of Congress. And so they're going to form a joint committee on Reconstruction. This is basically a group they're going to put together to work this out. Keep in mind, there's not going to be any Southerners on this group. This is important. In February 1866, the president vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau bill. Remember the Freedmen's Bureau teaching African Americans how to read? They tried to extend it. The president's like, no, we're not doing that. Then in March of 1866, Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Bill. The Civil Rights Bill of 1866 was passed to try to make the black codes go away. And so Congress says, yeah, we're over you. And at this point, Congress stops playing nice. And they take both of those bills that Johnson vetoed and they override the veto. So at this point, Johnson has lost his power. He's lost his influence because it doesn't matter what he vetoes, right? If Congress can override it, and if they have more power and more unity, it does not matter what he does. And so this is the first time in history that a president vetoed a bill and Congress overrode it successfully, but they do. All right, so from here, let's talk about Johnson and the role of the martyr. So Johnson begins to see himself. I don't think I got you to did I get you to his quote about Jesus? So they were, there was a one particular quote that she mentions that I love on there where they said, where they're yelling at him and calling him a traitor. And it was after he said that they talked about, he goes to one of the meetings and somebody screams out, hang Jefferson Davis.
And he said,
Hang Thad Stevens. Yeah. And so one of them says something to him, he says, you're acting like I'm Judas. I'm not Judas, I'm Jesus Christ. And so Johnson sees himself as like this Christ-like figure, that he is dying for a cause. I mean, that is how big his ego is. He's like, he thinks he is Jesus. So he might have gone over the edge a little bit. So check this out. Congress is done with him. In 1868, they ratified the 14th Amendment. This allows Congress, very importantly, to guarantee that all people born in the U.S. have citizenship rights. So this gives citizenship rights to African Americans. Now, I want to make sure if you're taking notes that you get this down because when we talk about the Gilded Age, the 14th Amendment is often going to be used to protect corporations. Because corporate companies will sue in court and say legally that their company was born in the U.S. and therefore it should have the same rights as a citizen. It has to be protected. All right. Some other things he does. Southern states are going to be punished. If they do not give rights to black citizens, Congress says, we're not dealing with it. You have to give rights that are required, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. Now, they're saying this now, sadly. We know they're not going to hold this standard. We know something's going to change because it does not take place the way it should have. However, when they put this in place, we see some important changes. I think this chart is very significant. This shows you the number of voters in different states. And what we start to see is there are some states that have more minority voters at this time than they have white citizens. And so for these white citizens that have been dominating politics, that gravy train is about to come to an end. Now, What also becomes interesting in this is if you look at states like Louisiana, although African Americans do not have the majority in the overall state, they do in certain areas. And so they're able to gain seats there as well. Now, why this matters for us is Mississippi is going to elect its first minority senator, a guy by the name of Hiram, Hiriam Revels, Revels. Have you ever heard of Hiram Revels?
Can you spell his name again?
Yes, Hiriam Revels. I'm looking for his picture. Revels. This is the first group of minority senators. And so, how did we get here? In 1868, but then we go back to none. Well, it's because of what's going to happen with Reconstruction. So, they're making some very positive choices here. They're moving forward. Things are progressing. Things are going well. Johnson is worked up and going a little crazy. He is ticked. And so the part you were listening to when I cut it off was talking about his speaking tour, what he calls the Swing Around the Circle tour. Johnson goes on tour and takes Ulysses S. Grant with him, which turns out to be a big mistake on both of their parts. And he goes into places trying to get people to vote for his policies. How does that work out? He offends more people than he connects with. In fact, after his speaking tour, the Republicans won a 3-1 majority in both houses. He was so bad that his enemies picked up seats. They were like, keep speaking, Johnson, keep speaking. Sometimes you do better when you keep your mouth shut, right? And he definitely would have. All right. But anyway, at this point, the North decides, the Senate decides that they are done with Johnson. And so they're going to take a very different approach to how to handle him. So here's what they do. First of all, they want to turn the southern states into military territories. Notice the terminology here. The terminology is very important. Can people in territories vote? No, not for president. They want to turn the southern states into conquered territories because they're like, you have behaved badly and we're going to treat you as such, which is kind of, in a way, understandable with what has gone on. They also want to require the South to pass new state constitutions in order to rejoin the Union as states that rectify and promote the 13th and 14th Amendment and guarantee suffrage for African Americans. And then lastly, they're going to put some restrictions on the president. So let's talk about what these specific 3 bills are. The first is the Military Reconstruction Act. It's going to establish 5 districts. 5 districts in the South. And I'm not concerned that you learn which states are in which district, but think about even the wording. They take away the term states. They put it to districts to where it makes them seem like they are less of a state entity, if you will. The second act that is so important, and it is huge, is the Tenure of Office Act. Now, the Tenure of Office Act is important because it said that the president can't fire a cabinet member. Now, help me out with this. You're all bright people. Is the cabinet in the Constitution? No. The cabinet is for the purpose of doing what? Advising the president. So realistically, should Congress have a whole lot of say over the cabinet? No. Not really. I mean, we do have it today where they have to approve the cabinet, but they do not dictate what the cabinet does or what they say or anything like that. So on this same line, on this same thought, this is passed saying he cannot fire cabinet members. And it's obviously directed to him. Why? Because they know he's crazy, and they know he's going to snap, and they know he's going to fire cabinet members, and that gives them a chance to start getting rid of him, right? So, is this law constitutional? Probably not. But it has to get before the Constitution before you decide that, or before the Supreme Court. So what happens? Johnson fires Stanton. There is one cabinet member that knows how to push Johnson's buttons, and I feel like after they pass this law, they're like, get it. And so Johnson fires Stanton. They draw up impeachment orders to have Johnson impeached. The orders are filed on February 24th before they even finish writing the charges. To add to this, the vote to remove him was the vote to impeach him was 126 to 47. Now, I want to make sure you understand this. Impeachment means tried. It does not mean removed. To be removed, it has to go before the Senate. And so here's what happens. They do go before the Senate. This trial lasts for 4 whole months. At the end of that 4 months, they lacked one more vote, and Johnson would have been the first president in U.S. history to have been impeached. Now, it has to be 2/3. Yeah. Because 2/3 is, to remove a president from office, it needs to be pretty serious. At any rate, after Johnson tries to run again for re-election, they do not accept him, and he is going to be replaced with Ulysses S. Grant. Now, what we're going to do, since some of you are going to leave, I don't want to finish out the last little part. I've only got like 10 more minutes left, but we will just tack that on to what we're going to say tomorrow, because you guys need to understand the end of Reconstruction. It's a pretty big deal. So for the rest of you, we will finish listening to Ashley.
And that is where things really started to go downhill. And they were only halfway through